My grandmother's house smelled like lavender and old photographs, and I thought that was where I would finally be safe. Instead, my aunt looked across the table at the reading of the will, smiled at me with her teeth, and said, "Honestly, sweetheart, we all knew Grandma loved you less." I didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just picked up my coffee cup with both hands, took one slow sip, and looked her dead in the eyes over the rim. She had no idea I'd been recording her for 3 months. My name is Vivian, and I'm 31 years old. I grew up spending every summer at my grandmother's house in Asheville, North Carolina. The white one with the wraparound porch and the wind chime she'd collected from every state she'd ever visited. She was the kind of woman who remembered how everyone took their coffee and kept a drawer full of birthday cards already stamped, just in case she forgot to mail them on time. She was the steadiest person I ever knew. She passed in March after a short illness, and for 3 weeks I drove the 4 hours from Charlotte every weekend just to sit with her. By the end, it was just the two of us most nights. My mother's sister, my aunt, showed up twice. Once for a few hours when the doctor said it looked serious, and once the day before my grandmother died when she brought flowers that my grandmother was too weak to smell. I should start at the beginning, or at least at the part where I first understood something was wrong. My grandmother had a financial advisor she'd worked with for over 20 years, a steady, careful man who she trusted completely. About 6 weeks before she died, she'd called me on a Sunday afternoon, which was unusual because she normally saved calls for weekday evenings. Her voice sounded thin but deliberate, like she was choosing each word individually. "Vivian," she said, "I want you to know that I've made my wishes clear. Everything is in writing. Don't let anyone confuse you about what I meant." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I said I wouldn't. She said she loved me. That was the last real conversation we had before she got too tired to talk much. After the funeral, my aunt moved quickly. That's the word I keep coming back to, quickly. Within 2 days, she was already calling my grandmother's financial advisor, copying my mother's cousin on the emails, having conversations I wasn't included in. She was the eldest daughter, technically, which she reminded everyone of at least once per interaction. She had opinions about the house, about the accounts, about a storage unit full of furniture that hadn't been opened in years. I found out about the first meeting through my grandmother's neighbor, who mentioned in passing that she'd seen my aunt's car in the driveway on a Tuesday. I hadn't been told about any Tuesday meeting. I started paying attention after that. My aunt had always had a particular way of operating. She was the kind of person who framed everything as concern. "I'm just worried about you," before saying something cutting. "I only say this because I love you," before saying something that had nothing to do with love. She had a talent for making people feel like disagreeing with her was the same as being difficult, and for years it had worked on me. I'd spent most of my 20s softening myself around her, laughing at the right moments, not pushing back. The shift started when I found a voicemail on my grandmother's home phone, the landline she'd kept out of habit, that my aunt had left 3 days before my grandmother died. I was at the house helping go through some paperwork when I saw the light blinking on the old handset on the kitchen counter. I played it without thinking. My aunt's voice filled the kitchen, and what she said made me go completely still. She was talking to my grandmother, but the tone was nothing like the concerned daughter voice I'd heard in public. She was telling my grandmother, who at that point could barely form full sentences, that changing the will at this stage would create legal complications. She said the word complications 4 times. She said that Vivian, meaning me, had her own life in Charlotte, wasn't really around the way she needed to be, and that certain decisions should reflect that. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen with my hand on the counter and listened to my aunt try to influence a dying woman's final documents over voicemail. I played it back 3 times. Then I took out my phone and recorded myself playing it again. I want to be clear about something. I did not do what came next out of rage. I did it because I had seen the pattern my whole life and I finally had evidence. For years, my aunt had been the one who managed perceptions. In our family, in our extended circle, at church, at the events my grandmother hosted. She had a reputation for being the reliable daughter, the one who handled things. She had traded on that reputation constantly, and she had traded on it with my grandmother. So I started documenting every phone call my aunt made to me in the weeks after the funeral. I noted the time and what she said. When she called to casually mention that she and the financial advisor had just had coffee to discuss the estate, I wrote it down. When she told me that she'd spoken to the attorney and that there were some details to sort out and that I probably shouldn't worry myself, I wrote it down. When she mentioned, almost as a footnote, that my grandmother's savings account had apparently been set up with the transfer on death designation that named my aunt as sole beneficiary, something she said my grandmother had done years ago, I didn't say a thing. I wrote it down. Then I called the financial advisor myself. He was quiet for a long moment when I introduced myself. I thought you knew, he said. Knew what? I asked. Another pause. There were some changes made to several accounts. About 14 months ago. He said it carefully, the way someone says something when they're not sure how much they're supposed to say. Your grandmother came in with your aunt. She said she wanted to update the beneficiary designations. Was that her idea? I asked. He didn't answer. But he also didn't say yes. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for 25 minutes without moving. 14 months ago, my grandmother had been sharp but starting to slow down a little. She'd had a minor fall that winter. She was still independent, still drove herself to book club, still called me on Sundays. But she'd also been a little more uncertain than before, a little more trusting of the people around her. I went back through my memories of that year. My aunt had visited more that winter than she usually did. She'd started introducing herself to my grandmother's neighbors. She'd offered to start helping with paperwork. At the time, I thought it was sweet. She seemed to finally be showing up the way she never had before. I had been so wrong about what I was seeing. I called a probate attorney that same week. I wasn't sure if I had a case. I told her everything I knew, starting with the voicemail, going through the account changes, ending with the financial advisor's silence. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she told me we might have grounds to look into undue influence. She told me to gather everything I had and to keep gathering. That was 8 weeks before the official reading of the will. I kept my expression neutral at every family interaction during those 8 weeks. My aunt would call and I'd answer warmly. She'd hint at the shape of things and I'd make vague, agreeable sounds. She started using the phrase what grandma really would have wanted frequently, always in ways that happened to align with what my aunt wanted. I'd say, you're probably right, and change the subject. I was not going to let her see me coming. The reading was at my grandmother's attorney's office, a small firm in downtown Asheville that my grandmother had worked with for decades. The attorney himself was a steady, unhurried man who clearly had liked my grandmother very much. My aunt arrived 12 minutes late and made a comment about traffic that no one responded to. The will itself was layered in the way old estate documents often are. There were specific bequests, the wind chime collection to me, which made my throat close up briefly, the furniture in the living room to be divided among the grandchildren. The house itself was to be sold and the proceeds split between her daughters. Then the attorney got to the financial accounts. My aunt had clearly expected something. She sat up a little straighter. She had her hands folded on the table with the particular composure of someone who has already decided how they're going to react to good news. The attorney explained that after a review of the account documentation and a conversation with a financial advisor, there had been some concerns raised about changes made to the transfer on death designations approximately 14 months prior. He said this carefully and without drama. He said my grandmother's original beneficiary designations, the ones on file before that visit, named both daughters equally. He said the changes had been flagged. My aunt's composure shifted by just a fraction. What does that mean exactly? She asked. The attorney explained, still calmly, that the estate would be administered according to the original designations while the matter was reviewed, that nothing had been finalized yet, that there were questions that needed to be answered. That was when my aunt looked at me, and I looked back, and she said what she said. Honestly, sweetheart, we all knew Grandma loved you less, and I just held my coffee cup and looked at her. She had no idea that 2 days before the reading, I had forwarded the voicemail recording to the attorney. She had no idea I'd spoken with the financial advisor a second time and that he'd agreed to provide a written account of the circumstances of that meeting 40 months ago. She had no idea that my grandmother's neighbor, who had been watching my aunt's visits more closely than anyone realized, had written a 3-page letter about what she had and hadn't seen during those winter months. I didn't say any of that in the room. I didn't need to. The attorney already had it all. What I said was this: I know exactly how much she loved me. My aunt opened her mouth and I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and said I needed some air. I walked out into the hallway and stood by the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the street below. My phone buzzed. A text from my cousin, my grandmother's other grandchild, who had been in the room but who my aunt had always overlooked. She looked scared. What's happening? I typed back. The truth is happening. Stay calm. I wasn't angry, standing there in that hallway. I expected to be. I'd thought about this moment so many times in the weeks leading up to it that I'd worn the emotion smooth. What I actually felt was very quiet, like the moment right before the power comes back on after a storm. The review took 11 weeks. During that time, my aunt called me 4 times. The first call was aggressive. She used the word betrayal and implied that what I'd done was somehow disrespectful to our grandmother's memory. I let her talk and then said very gently that I thought our grandmother had been very clear about her wishes and that I was making sure they were honored. Then I said goodbye. The second call was conciliatory. She said she was sure there had been a misunderstanding, that she'd only been trying to help, that the changes had been completely above board. I said I hoped the review would confirm that. The third call I didn't answer. The fourth call came at 8 in the morning on a Thursday. She said, and I will remember this for the rest of my life. I don't understand why you're doing this to our family. I sat with that for a second. I'm not doing anything to our family, I said. I'm doing something for Grandma. She hung up. The review concluded that the changes to the transfer on death designations had been made under circumstances that raised sufficient concerns about the grantor's capacity and the presence of undue influence. The accounts reverted to the original designations. My aunt received her share, exactly her share, no more, and I received mine. It wasn't a fortune. My grandmother had lived modestly and carefully, and what she left behind reflected that. But it was what she'd meant to leave. It was her actual wishes intact, not overwritten by someone who had learned to work the edges of her trust. I didn't feel triumphant when the letter arrived. I want to be honest about that. I felt something smaller and sadder. The particular grief of understanding exactly what my aunt had been willing to do and how close it had come to working. For a week, I moved through my apartment slowly, made a lot of tea I didn't finish, and called my grandmother's neighbor more than once just to talk. My cousin texted me, I know it doesn't fix everything, but thank you for what you did. I read that text about 6 times. About a month after everything concluded, I heard through my mother's side of the family that my aunt had told people a version of events in which she was the one who had been wronged, that I had manipulated the process, that I'd turned the financial advisor against her, that our grandmother had not been in her right mind during her final years, and that this whole outcome was a tragedy. There were relatives who believed her. There are probably relatives who still believe her. That's the thing about people who are skilled at managing perception. They don't stop just because they've been caught. I let it go. Not because it didn't sting, but because I understood something that I don't think my aunt ever learned. Reputation is not the same as truth, and protecting one at the expense of the other is a trade that always costs more than it seems. I went back to Ashford for a weekend in late fall. The house had been listed for sale by then, as the will directed, and the young couple had already made an offer. I asked the estate attorney if I could walk through it one last time before closing. He arranged it. The house was emptier than I'd ever seen it. The wind chimes were gone, packed carefully in tissue paper in a box in my trunk. The kitchen smelled like cleaning products instead of lavender. Someone had left a single coffee cup on the counter, which made no sense, and I stood there looking at it for a while. I sat on the back porch for maybe an hour, just watching the yard. The neighbor came out eventually and waved from across the fence, and I waved back. We didn't need to say anything. I thought about my grandmother calling me on that Sunday afternoon, choosing her words carefully, telling me not to let anyone confuse me about what she meant. I thought about how she'd known. She'd known something was off, even then. She hadn't been able to say it plainly. Maybe she'd been too tired, or too careful, or too uncertain. But she had tried to leave me what she could, a warning, wrapped in love, tucked into a phone call I almost didn't think twice about. I don't know if she would have called what I did brave. She wasn't someone who used words like that casually. She might have just called it right, in the plain way she had of assessing things. A few weeks after the Asheville trip, my aunt sent me an email. No subject line. It said, "I hope you're proud of yourself." I read it twice. Then I thought about the wind chimes packed in my trunk. I thought about my grandmother stamping birthday cards in advance just in case. I thought about 11 weeks of quiet, careful work to make sure one woman's actual wishes survived intact. I wrote back one sentence, "I am." Then I closed my laptop and didn't think about her again for a very long time. The wind chimes are hanging on my balcony now. There are 17 of them. She really had visited a lot of states. On windy days, they're almost too loud, this layered, overlapping sound that carries into my apartment when I have the door open. My downstairs neighbor knocked once to ask about them, and I explained, and she said, "Oh, that's actually really sweet," and went back downstairs. I kept thinking I'd feel some kind of resolution, some defined moment where I knew it was over and things were okay. But grief doesn't work like that, and neither does justice, I think. It comes in quieter. It comes in the particular way I sleep now compared to how I slept during those 11 weeks. It comes in the fact that when my phone rings in the morning, I no longer hold my breath before I look at the screen. My grandmother was the steadiest person I ever knew, and she raised me in summers and Sunday phone calls and birthday cards stamped in advance to know that love that asks nothing back is the only kind worth building a life around. I am exactly who she thought I was. That was always the whole point. There's a version of this story where I do nothing, where I play back that voicemail, set the handset down on my grandmother's kitchen counter, and decide it isn't worth the fight. I used to be that version of myself, the one who decided that keeping the peace was the same thing as having peace. It isn't. I know that now in a way I can't unknow. What my aunt counted on was that I would stay quiet. She had good reasons to think I would. I'd been quiet my whole life around her, laughing at the right moments, not pushing back, shrinking myself into whatever shape made the room easier to be in. That kind of quiet isn't kindness. It's just a habit that gets mistaken for one. And habits, I've learned, are not the same as character. What changed for me wasn't rage. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect revenge stories to come from a hot place. This didn't. What I felt when I played back that voicemail was cold and clarifying, like a window being cleaned. I could suddenly see exactly what had been in front of me for years. And once you see something that clearly, you have a choice about what kind of person you're going to be, not what kind of outcome you're going to get. That part you can't control, but what kind of person, that's always yours. I chose to be someone who does the careful work, who calls the attorney and asks the uncomfortable question and sits in her car for 25 minutes processing the answer before she drives home, who documents things not out of vengeance but out of respect for her grandmother, for what was right, for the version of herself that she was still becoming. That took something I hadn't known I had. The willingness to be methodical when everything in me wanted to collapse, and the honesty to admit that I was scared the whole time. Being steady and being scared are not opposites. I have lived that. My aunt was smart in her way. She understood how systems work, how documents get changed, how timing matters when someone's capacity is uncertain. What she didn't understand or didn't believe was that I was paying attention. People who have operated unchecked for a long time tend to stop assuming they're being watched. That's the particular blindness that comes from never having been held accountable. And the accountability, when it finally arrives exactly as heavy as the years of weight that built up behind it. I think about my grandmother choosing her words carefully on that Sunday phone call. She was trying to tell me something she couldn't say plainly. She was counting on me to be someone who would understand, who would hold the line, who would not let her actual wishes get quietly buried under someone else's convenience. She had raised me, in summers and Sunday calls and small steady lessons, to be someone with enough integrity to do what was right even when it was complicated. She had trusted me with that. The whole thing, when I look at it honestly, was an act of love on her part and an act of love on mine. What I carried off those 11 weeks was not satisfaction exactly. It was something quieter, the understanding that doing right by someone, really doing it all the way through when it cost you something, that's not a grand gesture. It's just a long series of small decisions made in the same direction. You call the attorney, you ask the question, you show up to the room even when your hands are shaking, you answer the phone with your voice steady, you do the next thing. And then one day the wind chimes are on your balcony and you can sleep through the night again, and that, finally, is what it feels like to be exactly who you were supposed to be.